Wyoming Territory, the autumn of 1878. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a killing frost. Along the base of a sweeping sandstone escarpment, a solitary figure was engaged in an act of apparent madness. His name was Elias Thorne. He was 19 years old, lean from hunger and hard labor, and he was chipping away at the solid rock face with a hammer and a sharpened piece of steel. Each strike was a sharp crack against the immense silence of the landscape. Chip by chip, handful by handful, he was digging a hole. Not a mine, not a prospect, but a home. Passing trappers would stop their mules, watch him for a while with a mixture of pity and contempt, and then ride on, shaking their heads. In the nearest settlement, a dusty collection of cabins called Providence, his project had already earned a name. They called it Thorne's Tomb. The boy was digging his own grave, they said. He would be buried by a rockfall, or, failing that, he would freeze in his damp, cold hole come December. It was a fool's errand, born of desperation and ignorance. But what did this abandoned boy, this outcast with calloused hands and a quiet, stubborn set to his jaw, understand about the very earth beneath their feet? What secret was he chipping away at, that every seasoned builder and hardened frontiersman in the territory had completely missed? His answer wouldn't come in words. It would come in the form of a storm that would try to wipe Providence off the map. If you believe that sometimes the oldest ideas are the most powerful, hit that subscribe button and join us. We dig up forgotten wisdom that still holds true today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel. To understand Elias's desperate gamble, you must first understand the enemy he was facing. Winter in this part of Wyoming was not a season. It was a predator. It stalked the plains and the high country, relentless and unforgiving. It came on the back of a wind that could strip the warmth from a man's bones in minutes. A wind that carried snow so fine and hard it felt like sand-blasting ice. Temperatures didn't just drop, they plummeted into a realm where survival itself was an act of defiance. 40 below zero was not uncommon. At that temperature, steel becomes brittle. Exposed skin freezes in less than a minute. A man could die walking from his cabin to his woodpile. The settlers in Providence fought this enemy with the only weapons they knew: wood and fire. They built their cabins from lodgepole pine, felling the trees and notching them with practiced skill. They chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud, moss, and grass. These cabins were symbols of frontier grit, monuments to their determination to carve a life from the wilderness, but they were flawed. Deeply, fundamentally flawed. The wood, for all its strength, was a poor barrier against the relentless cold. The chinking would dry and shrink, opening up 100 tiny cracks for the wind to knife through. A family could huddle around a roaring stove, feeding it a constant diet of precious, hard-won firewood, and still see their breath plume in the air. The walls on the far side of the room would be coated in a delicate, beautiful, and deadly layer of frost. Ink froze in its wells. Water barrels had to be kept near the fire, or they would split open, solid as granite. Children slept buried under every blanket the family owned, their faces peeking out from mounds of wool and canvas, their dreams filled with a cold that seeped up from the very floorboards. The fight for warmth was constant, exhausting, and often a losing battle. They were burning through their fuel at a terrifying rate, living in a constant state of thermal siege. Elias Thorne knew this battle. He had seen it from a different perspective. He wasn't a builder or a frontiersman. He was the son of a Cornish miner, brought to America as a boy to work the deep shafts of Pennsylvania. His childhood was spent not under an open sky, but in the deep, quiet dark of the earth. Down in those mines, he had learned a fundamental truth. 100 feet below the surface, the world was different. In the blistering heat of August, the rock was cool to the touch. In the grip of a January blizzard, that same rock felt strangely mild. The deep earth didn't care about the seasons. It held a steady, constant temperature, somewhere around 55 degrees, year in and year out. It was a place of thermal stability, a stark contrast to the violent temperature swings on the surface. His family had been drawn west by the promise of silver, but they had brought their hard luck with them. A mine collapse had left Elias with a permanent dragging limp, marking him as damaged goods in a world that valued physical strength above all else. When the silver vein in their last claim gave out, his father and brothers made a cold calculation. Feeding another mouth, a slow mouth, was a liability they couldn't afford. One morning, Elias woke up to an empty camp. They had left him with a mule, a few tools, and a note that said little more than Godspeed. He was alone. He had no money to buy lumber, no skill to build a proper cabin, and no community to help him. All he had was a memory of the deep earth and a desperate, unconventional idea. He looked not at the forests for logs, but at the cliffs for shelter. He chose his spot with a miner's eye, a tall, south-facing cliff of sandstone, south-facing, to catch every minute of the low winter sun. Sandstone, because it was softer than granite, workable with the simple hand tools he possessed. He wasn't just looking for a windbreak. He was looking for a battery, a giant geological battery that had been soaking up the sun's energy for 1,000 summers. The work began. It was brutal, monotonous, and punishing. His tools were a heavy sledgehammer, a few star drills he'd made from old wagon springs, and a set of iron chisels. The process was agonizingly slow. He would drill a series of holes, pound in the chisels, and then lever out a chunk of rock. At the end of a full day's labor, from sunup to sundown, the hole might be only a few inches deeper. His hands bled, his shoulders ached. The jarring shock of hammer on steel vibrated through his bones. He didn't just dig a crude cave. He was designing, shaping. He made the entrance low and narrow, barely 5 feet high, knowing that warm air rises and a smaller opening would be easier to seal. Once inside, the ceiling rose to a comfortable 7 feet. He spent weeks drilling a flue, a narrow chimney 6 inches in diameter, straight up through 12 feet of solid rock, angling it carefully so it would draw smoke from a small fire pit he planned near the entrance. At the back of the chamber, he didn't clear the floor flat. He left a wide section of rock raised 2 feet off the ground. This would be his bed, a solid stone platform, insulated from the colder floor. Every feature was deliberate, born from his memory of how air and heat behaved in confined spaces underground. One afternoon, a man on a fine-looking horse rode up. He was older, with a thick gray beard and hands that looked as strong and capable as forged iron. This was Jedediah Croft, the man who had built the trading post and nearly every other respectable structure in Providence. He was the region's undisputed expert on building. Croft dismounted and watched Elias work for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice not unkind, but heavy with authority. "Son, what do you think you're doing?" Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a dusty forearm. "Building a place to winter." Croft gestured at the hole with his thumb. "In there? You're not building, you're quarrying, and you're making a fatal mistake." This was the voice of experience, the voice of conventional wisdom. Croft's objections were not born of malice, but of practical, hard-won knowledge. They were logical, they were sensible, and they were completely wrong. "That rock is full of moisture," Croft stated, his tone that of a teacher explaining a simple fact. "Come the first hard freeze, it'll sweat. Water will condense on your walls and ceiling. Everything you own will be damp. You'll be living in a dripping, moldy icebox. You'll catch your death of lung fever before Christmas. Elias considered this. I'm making a flue. A fire will keep it dry. Croft shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. A fire? In a hole with one exit? You'll be lucky if you don't choke on your own smoke. And even if you get a draw, that stone will suck the heat right out of the flames. You'll burn 10 cords of wood just to feel a hint of warmth. It's a heat sink. Son. A tomb. He kicked at a pile of sandstone chips. You're wasting what's left of the good weather on this. You could have a small log shelter up by now. Something that might see you through. This is suicide. Elias simply turned back to the cliff face and picked up his hammer. It's what I have, he said, his voice flat. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just kept working. The sharp crack of steel on stone was his only reply. Croft watched him for another minute, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He mounted his horse and rode away. The story he told back in Providence cemented the legend of Thorne's tomb. The boy was not just a fool, he was a stubborn fool. He had been warned by the best, and he had refused to listen. The mockery grew. Children would dare each other to run up and peek into the crazy man's cave. At the trading post, men would laugh about it over cracker barrels. Heard Thorne's trying to drill a chimney now. Thinks he's a badger. It became a dark joke, a cautionary tale about what happens when a man turns his back on common sense. Elias heard the whispers. He saw the looks. But he was driven by a force more powerful than shame, the certainty of his memory and the terror of the coming winter. He worked, his world shrinking to the circle of rock in front of him, the ache in his muscles, and the slow, steady progress of his excavation. By the time the first snow flurries dusted the high peaks, the main chamber was done. It was a space roughly 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep. The walls were surprisingly smooth, the tool marks creating a rough, organic pattern. He had built a heavy door from scavenged planks and hung it on thick leather hinges. He had lined his stone bed with a thick mattress of dried grass and pine boughs. He had a small stack of firewood, carefully gathered and seasoned. Now, with the physical labor complete, the genius of his system could be understood. It wasn't a cave, it was an engine, a passive geothermal engine. The principle was thermal mass. An object with high thermal mass, like a mountain of sandstone, takes a very long time to heat up and a very long time to cool down. It resists change. Throughout the long, hot summer, the cliff had been absorbing solar energy, baking in the sun day after day. This warmth hadn't just heated the surface, it had penetrated deep into the rock, storing countless BTUs of energy. Now, as the outside air cooled, that stored heat began to slowly, imperceptibly radiate back out. The rock itself was a massive, low-temperature radiator. It wouldn't feel warm to the touch, but it would hold the interior space at a stable baseline temperature, likely around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the weather outside was doing. A conventional log cabin had almost no thermal mass. It was a thin skin between the occupant and the killer cold. The moment the fire died down, the temperature inside would plummet to match the outside. The cabin was in a constant, desperate war with the exterior temperature. Elias's dwelling was different. He wasn't at war with the cold. He had retreated into a fortress of thermal stability. His small fire didn't have to fight a 90-degree temperature differential. It didn't have to heat a room from -30 up to a livable temperature. The rock had already done the heavy lifting, providing a stable 50-degree environment. His fire only needed to raise that temperature by a comfortable 10 or 15 degrees. It was an astonishingly efficient system. The rock was the shield, The fire was just for comfort. This was the secret he had brought with him from the deep mines. This was what Jedediah Croft and the others, with their focus on logs and insulation, could never have understood. Then, December came. It arrived not with a gentle snowfall, but with a silent, menacing change in the sky. The air grew unnaturally still. The horizon to the north took on a bruised, purple-gray color. Experienced frontiersmen saw it and felt a primal dread. This was a blue norther, an Arctic clipper, a wave of polar air rolling down from the barren lands, unchecked across the frozen plains. The first day, the temperature at dawn was a brisk but manageable 15 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, it was 5 degrees. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that grew into a piercing shriek. That night, the thermometer in front of the Providence trading post read -12. The next morning, it was -25, and it was still dropping. This was not a normal cold snap. This was a generational weather event, a storm that would be spoken of for the next 50 years. The wind was a physical force, driving snow so hard it scoured the bark from trees on the windward side. The world outside the cabins became a white, featureless hell of screaming air and lethal cold. Inside the cabins of Providence, life became a desperate struggle. The flaws of their construction were laid bare. The wind found every crack in the chinking, blasting jets of Arctic air into the rooms. Families stuffed rags, clothes, anything they could find, into the gaps. But it was useless. The cold seeped through the very logs themselves. The consumption of firewood became terrifying. Stoves that would normally glow red with a few logs now had to be stuffed to capacity, roaring day and night. A week's supply of wood was gone in a day. Then, 2. Men risked their lives in the blinding storm to chop more wood, their axes ringing against frozen timber, their beards and eyebrows caking with ice. Soon, they began to burn what they could: fence posts, spare furniture, a child's broken rocking horse. The air inside the cabins was thick with smoke and the smell of fear. Despite the raging fires, the indoor temperatures hovered just above freezing. Water froze a few feet from the stove. It was a losing battle. The predator was at the door, and it was winning. In his own cabin, the one he had built with his own expert hands, Jedediah Croft was facing the failure of his life's work. His home was considered the best built in the settlement, tight and solid. But it was not enough. The north wall was a sheet of white frost. He and his wife bundled in every layer they owned, huddled near the iron stove, its surface glowing a dull cherry red. Yet, 10 feet away, a cup of water he'd forgotten on a table was frozen solid. He was a master carpenter, a man who understood wood better than he understood most people, and his knowledge was useless. The cold was a force of nature that simply overwhelmed his craft. He felt a profound sense of helplessness, of being betrayed by the very principles he had trusted his entire life. And in that cold, desperate haze, a thought began to gnaw at him. The boy, the fool boy, in his stone hole. Croft had been so certain, so smug in his pronouncements of the boy's doom. He had predicted a damp, frozen tomb. He imagined Elias Thorne now, a block of ice in the dark, a tragic monument to stubborn pride. A profound and unsettling guilt settled over him. He had mocked the boy, confirmed the town's ridicule, and then left him to his fate. What if the boy had tried to leave, to make it to town, and was now lying in a snowdrift somewhere? The thought became an obsession. He had to know. It was a foolish, dangerous impulse, but it was stronger than his fear of the storm. He told his wife he was checking the livestock. A lie to spare her the worry. He bundled himself in canvas, wool, and fur until he was a shapeless mound and stepped out into the howling fury of the blizzard. The journey to the cliff was a nightmare. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath and trying to knock him from his feet. The snow was thigh-deep, a thick, grinding powder that made every step an agony. He couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of him. He navigated by instinct, keeping the wind at a certain angle to his cheek, his face numb and burning at the same time. It took him nearly an hour to cover a distance he could normally walk in 15 minutes. Finally, he saw it. The dark gash of the cliff face, a deeper shadow in the swirling white. He stumbled towards it, his hopes sinking. There was no sign of life, no smoke, no light. He had been right. The boy was dead. He had come all this way just to confirm his own grim prophecy. He reached the low entrance, shielded from the worst of the wind by an overhang. The plank door was sealed tight. He hammered on it with a frozen mitten, his blows making a dull thud. "Elias, Elias Thorne!" he shouted, his voice snatched away by the wind. He was about to turn away when he heard a scraping sound from within. The door swung inward, and Jedediah Croft's world tilted on its axis. He was hit not by a wave of cold, but by a gentle, impossible wave of warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a calm, steady, and profound warmth. The roar of the blizzard was instantly cut off, replaced by a deep, comforting silence, punctuated only by the soft crackle of a tiny fire. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him. His eyes, watering from the cold, struggled to adjust to the dim light. He saw Elias, sitting on a low stone stool. The boy was not bundled in furs. He was in his shirt sleeves. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows. Croft's gaze swept the chamber, his builder's mind trying to process a series of impossible facts. There was no frost on the walls. The stone was bare and dry. The air smelled clean, with the faint, pleasant scent of wood smoke and something else, roasting potatoes. In the corner, a stray dog Elias must have taken in thumped its tail on a bed of furs, but didn't bother to get up. The space felt not like a cave, but like a sanctuary. It was calm. It was normal. And in the middle of this apocalyptic storm, normalcy felt like a miracle. Croft was a practical man. His mind rejected miracles. He began to investigate, his expertise turning into a tool for his own astonishment. He peeled off a mitten and pressed his bare hand against the deep stone wall at the back of the dwelling. He expected a biting, draining cold. Instead, the rock was merely cool, neutral. It wasn't stealing his heat. It felt stable, ancient, and utterly indifferent to the rage outside. He looked at the fire. It was tiny, a pathetic little blaze compared to the furnace he was running in his own cabin. A few small logs glowed peacefully in the stone-lined pit. Next to it was the woodpile. Croft stared at it, his mind refusing to accept what he was seeing. It was a small, neat stack, barely a dozen logs. It was a morning's worth of fuel, not a week's. His mind was reeling, searching for an explanation that made sense. There had to be a flaw in his observations. He turned to Elias, who was watching him with a quiet, unreadable expression. "What's the temperature?" Croft's voice was hoarse, a ragged whisper. Elias pointed to a small spirit thermometer hanging from a nail driven into a wooden peg in the wall. Croft leaned in. The silver line was steady, unwavering. It read 58 degrees, 58. Croft felt a dizzying sense of dislocation. It was at least 35 below zero outside, probably colder with the wind. That was a 93-degree difference. His own cabin, with a firebox full of roaring oak, was struggling to stay above 40. This boy, with a handful of twigs, was living in springtime comfort. The numbers were undeniable. They were a hammer blow to his lifetime of certainty. He looked from the thermometer to the tiny fire, to the ridiculously small wood pile. The final crucial question came, and he almost choked on it. How much wood? How much have you burned since the storm began? Elias shrugged. Not much, maybe a quarter of a cord. A quarter of a cord. In 3 days. Jedediah Croft had burned through nearly 3 full cords, more than 10 times the amount of fuel, to achieve a result that was demonstrably, catastrophically worse. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about shelter, heat, and survival shattered. He wasn't looking at a foolish boy. He was looking at a genius, a man who had sidestepped the entire battle he was so badly losing. Elias hadn't fought the cold. He had made peace with the earth, and the earth had given him shelter in return. Croft sank onto a stone bench, the strength gone from his legs. He looked at Elias, at the rolled-up sleeves, at the quiet confidence in his eyes, the mockery, the smug certainty, the pity. It all curdled into a profound and humbling shame. He finally spoke, and the words were the hardest he had ever had to utter. I was wrong. He said it again, louder, as if to convince himself. I was completely and utterly wrong. This place, it's not a tomb. It's the warmest house in Wyoming. He looked up at Elias, his expression stripped of all pride. You have to teach me, he said, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. You have to teach me how you did this? When the great storm finally broke 5 days later, Jedediah Croft returned to Providence, not with the tale of a boy's tragic death, but with a gospel of salvation. The townspeople, emerging from their cold, battered homes, were skeptical at first, but Croft was their most trusted voice. His conversion was too sudden, too absolute to be dismissed. He led a small group of the settlement's most respected men out to the cliff. They walked into Thorne's dwelling, from the biting wind into the impossible calm. They put their hands on the dry stone walls. They saw the tiny woodpile. They felt the steady, even warmth. They left as believers. The legacy of Thorne's tomb began. That spring, no new log cabins were built in Providence. Instead, under Croft's direction and Elias's quiet guidance, work began on a series of new dwellings carved directly into the sandstone cliffs. Croft, the master of wood, became a student of stone. He brought his builder's ingenuity to the new challenge, figuring out better ways to frame doorways and windows, how to integrate storage shelves carved from the rock itself. Elias became an unlikely teacher. He never sought a leadership role, but he was the source. He showed them how to read the grain of the rock, how to find the strongest layers. He explained in his simple, direct way the importance of the southern exposure, the low entryway, the high flue. He shared his knowledge freely, without arrogance, with the same quiet determination he had shown while chipping away at the rock face alone. The settlement was transformed. The cliff dwellings, as they came to be known, were warm in the winter and, as the settlers discovered that first summer, remarkably cool in the heat. They were fireproof. They were impervious to the wind. They were safe. The community, which had once mocked Elias as an outcast, had now literally centered itself around his idea. They had not just accepted him. They had followed him into the earth. The true impact of Elias's innovation wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human lives. It was measured in the cry of a newborn baby who survived her first winter, not in a drafty cabin on the edge of hypothermia, but in a warm, stable room where the greatest danger was sleeping too soundly. It was measured in the simple dignity of a family able to move freely about their home in the dead of winter without being tethered to a ravenous stove. It was the end of the war with winter. Elias Thorne hadn't just built himself a home, he had given his entire community a fortress. The story of Elias Thorne is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most elegant solutions are hidden in plain sight. waiting for a desperate mind to see them. It speaks to the conflict between entrenched tradition and radical innovation, and how empirical evidence, the undeniable truth of a warm room in a blizzard, can shatter the most stubborn prejudices. The arrogance of dismissing what we do not understand is a timeless human failing. The principles Elias Thorne applied through instinct and observation are alive today in modern architecture. Earth-sheltered homes, passive solar design, and the use of thermal mass are cornerstones of sustainable building. They are testaments to the simple, powerful idea that working with nature is always more effective than fighting against it. If this story made you think differently about the ground beneath your feet, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories of forgotten wisdom and relentless ingenuity. We're curious. What's the coldest winter you've ever had to endure? Share your story in the comments below. The account you have just heard is a fictionalized narrative created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and scientific principles of thermal mass and earth-sheltered dwellings are real and historically significant, the characters, specific locations, and events depicted are products of creative storytelling. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.